Hey everybody, we are going to start reading a story called Flat Stanley. You may be familiar with this. We're going to talk about it as we read, and then later this week you should be receiving something special in the mail. Right. Flat Stanley, His Original Adventure by Jeff Brown. Pictures by Mackie Pimenton. The Big Bulletin Board. All right, let's make a guess. Who do you think this is? Yeah, I think that's Stanley. All right, we kind of have that idea because we know that there's a character in this story called Stanley, right? And there's one picture in the book so far, and so far it's a boy. So that's a good guess. All right, the big bulletin board. Breakfast was ready. I will go wake the boys, Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband, George Lambchop. Just then, their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom he shared with his brother, Stanley. Oh, so now we have an idea. This could be Arthur and this could be Stanley. Now we know of two characters. Hey, come and look. Hey! Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were both very much in favor of politeness and careful speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people. Mr. Lambchop said as they entered the bedroom. Try to remember that. Excuse me, Arthur said, but look! He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay the enormous bulletin board that Mr. Lambchop had given the boys a Christmas ago so that they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would still have been sleeping if he had not been woken by his brother's shout. So, now let's guess, who do we think this is? If we know that Stanley is flattened on his bed, is this picture of Stanley? No, this is a picture of his brother Arthur. Let's find out what happened. What is going on here? He called out cheerfully from beneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed. Heavens, said Mrs. Lambchop. Gosh, said Arthur, Stanley's flat. As a pancake, said Mr. Lambchop. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Let's all have breakfast, Mrs. Lambchop said. Then Stanley and I will go see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say. In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley all over. How do you feel? He asked. Does it hurt very much? I felt sort of tickly after a while after I got up, Stanley Lambchop said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. We'll have to keep an eye on this young fellow, he said when he had finished his examination. Sometimes we doctors, despite all of our years of training and experience, can only marvel at how little we really know. Okay, so what has happened so far in this story? Yes, so first, Arthur yelled to his parents, right? They came and saw Stanley, and he was flattened by a bulletin board. So, tell me the characters in this story. We have Stanley, we have Arthur, and then we have Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop, their parents, right? And now, Stanley went somewhere else. He went to the doctor's office. So that's another character in our story. Dr. Dan is another character. So how about the settings in our story? Where were they at the beginning? They were at home. Okay, so they were at the Lambchop's home, where Mr. and Mrs. and Arthur and Stanley all live. Excuse me, now the setting has changed a little. Where are they now? Excuse me. At the doctor's office. So we've had two settings so far in this story. How about some feelings? At first, Arthur was feeling worried, right? He yelled to his parents and he was worried. He was feeling worried about his brother. And Stanley said that he was feeling kind of tingly, right? Tickly. He was feeling tickly when he first got up. So those are some other feeling words, okay? So his body was feeling a little bit different. All right. So is there a problem in this story yet? I would say so. I would say that the problem in this story is that Stanley is now flat. That is a problem. The plan right now, as Dr. Dan said, the plan is to just wait and see, right? Okay, so Mrs. Lambchop said that she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered by a tailor now. So Dr. Dan told his nurse, told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements. Mrs. Lambchop wrote them down. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. Okay, so 4 feet tall, a foot wide, so that would be from one shoulder to another shoulder, right? And half an inch thick. So that is only about this wide. So he's just this thick. So a big, if the piece of paper is really flat, it'd be lots of pieces of paper about this thick. What do you think is going to happen next? Should we make a prediction? I mean, he's going to have to still go to school, right? Let's see. Chapter 2, Being Flat. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms, even when the door was closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Why couldn't Arthur get under the door? He's not flat, right? Stanley is flat. Remember, Arthur is his brother. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." So what is the problem in chapter 2? Mrs. Lambchop lost her ring. Nice job. And Stanley has a plan. What is his plan? His plan, he tied his shoelaces together, and his plan is for him to go down in the sidewalk and look for that ring. Do you think he's going to find it? It's a pretty good plan. Let's see if it worked. Oh, there he goes. He's down. So up here is where his mother is, right? His mother is up on the sidewalk. "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I'm not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. We've caught a cuckoo." Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" What do you think that means? He found it. I think so too. Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame." The policeman apologized. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We've been hasty. We see that now." "People should think twice about making such rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." Okay, so were the policemen being very kind? They were not. Nope, they weren't. So the plan was, right, the problem, Mrs. Lambchop dropped her ring, lost her ring. Stanley made a plan to use the shoelaces and go down. And the solution was that after he was down in the shaft, he was able to find the ring. Awesome. So we've already had a problem, a plan, and a solution in place. The problem that we haven't solved yet is Stanley being flat. Do we think that's still a problem? Some people might say no, some people might say yes. I would say it's not normal because he's usually not flat, right? So this is something different. So maybe we're just not solving a problem. Maybe we're solving something that has happened that's different. The policeman realized that was a good rule and they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mrs. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive," he said. "I will have to think of a cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. Okay, so we have another problem, right? So Stanley got a piece of mail and asking for him to come and visit his friend. The problem is that he can't get there because it's expensive. It's expensive to take a train. It's expensive to take an airplane. So I think Mr. Lamb Chop has a plan. What do you think his plan is with that envelope? I agree. I think that somebody's going to get inside of that envelope. Now then, Stanley, he said, try this for size. The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lamb Chop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a toothbrush case filled with milk. They had put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train and airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop slid Stanley into his envelope, along with an egg salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk, and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lamb Chop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before, and she rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear," Mrs. Lamb Chop said, and then she and Mr. Lamb Chop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings on to show it was an airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it valuable and fragile and this end up on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lamb Chop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the Postal Service, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. All right, we are going to end this for right now, and tomorrow I'll read some more of this story. All right, I'm going to add a Google quiz under our classroom so that you can answer some questions about what we read today, and then I'll see you again tomorrow.